Apologies for those of you expecting Ira Horowitz from Corner Shop Creative on this talk today. Ira is not feeling well, so I am Ben Byrne, also from Corner Shop Creative, and I am his stand-in. Just to do a quick introduction, again, I'm Ben Byrne. My pronouns are he, him. I am based in California, and if anybody attending this talk is visually impaired, you want sort of a visual of me, I'm wearing a sort of dark blue-green collared shirt. I'm a white male. Starting to go bald. I have black headphones on and some Star Wars Legos in the background. And I'll turn it over to my co-presenter, Allison, to talk about herself.
Good morning. I am Allison Hinchman. I am based in DC. My preferred pronouns are she, her. And I currently have purple, I'm a white woman and I currently have purple hair. I'm wearing silver headphones. Yeah.
All right. So hopefully you are in the right place. We are going to be talking about stop redesigning your organization's website and start evolving it. I'm going to do the first half of the talk and go into some of sort of the theory and sort of the basic ideas behind what this means, what this concept is. And then I'll turn it over to Allison to actually talk about her experiences at the National Trust for Historic Preservation in terms of how they've gone about this approach and what they've learned and that sort of stuff going through it. So to get started, I just want to talk very simply about what we mean when we say iterative web design, which is what this talk is really about. This actually, I've heard it called many other things, incremental web design, data-informed web design, cyclical web design. I don't know that there's a standard name for it. But what we mean by this is sort of a cyclical process where different aspects of a website are changed over time. So maybe during one release cycle, the nav gets redesigned. Then over a next cycle, the press room area of the website gets redesigned or new content added. Maybe over the next cycle, the footer gets redesigned or, something else changes. You could even, do some rebranding, like your purple has now changed to red everywhere or something like that. Although, as Allison will talk about, that can come with some challenges. But the idea here is that it's a cyclical process, that you start with some problem, something that's a problem either for your users or for you internally. You figure out how you might want to change that. You build that out, you implement it, and then hopefully you've got the resources and time to deploy that and analyze that change and see, did traffic go up? Are people using that new part of the site? Has that had sort of the benefit that you were looking for? Again, whether for your users or for yourself, did it solve that problem? And then you sort of go back and you can either like continue to address that problem if you didn't resolve it, or you can move on to the next one or something like that. But that's the basic concept here behind this idea of sort of iterative web design. And to sort of contrast this, I want to talk a little bit about the more, what I would say, traditional process has been that we've seen where, every certain number of years, maybe for your organization, it's 5 or 10, maybe you're doing it every 2 or 3, but that you're throwing the whole website out almost and starting over again. Maybe you migrate your content, but like it's pretty much a fundamental redesign every time, every certain number of years. And I want to talk a little bit about what we see as sort of the challenges and problems with that approach. The metaphor, or the way I like to think about this is thinking about a site like Facebook or Twitter and how those sites are very different than they were 5 years ago in terms of how they looked and how they worked. But they've changed gradually. It's not that everybody woke up one morning and Facebook had suddenly added all of this new stuff. It's just like, as a developer, it can be frustrating because I feel like every week Facebook has changed something somewhere. But it allows your site to evolve rather than just startle everybody with change. And that's good because users can actually be really disoriented when they, if they go to bed on Friday and they wake up on Monday and visit your site and it's completely different. Maybe you've changed all of your branding and you've reorganized, and you moved from Drupal to WordPress, your discussion forums are gone, like whatever you've done. They, especially for users who are super familiar with you, it could be disorienting because they used to know, they might have some stuff bookmarked or they used to know how to find things. And also for users who are maybe only kind of familiar with you, that like they were at the site a couple of months ago and they wanted to dig something up to show a friend. Like, oh, is this the website I was on? I'm not even sure if this is the right thing. So it can be very disruptive to your users and really turn them off to do a full redesign. Another pitfall of a full redesign is that they can often negatively impact your search engine optimization. So it can be possible to mitigate this, if you're thoughtful about it and you're making sure that you're getting your redirect set up and you're submitting your new sitemap and all that kind of stuff. And also, if one of the reasons you're redesigning is because your old site's SEO was like terrible or non-existent, maybe this isn't such a consideration. But generally speaking, when you see a re-architecture of a site and URLs and structure and all that is changing, you take an SEO hit for a while until like Google and the spiders can sort of like relearn your site and relearn what's there and prove that sort of this new site is just as popular as the old one was. And this is a challenge that sometimes organizations don't even remember to think about. They're so focused on like the nuts and bolts of just getting the new site out there. They may not be thinking about the SEO hit that they're going to take at launch for maybe a month or so. Another pitfall of the redesign process is just internal capacity and ongoing maintenance of the existing website. So especially now in the era of coronavirus, your organization's website is the epicenter of your organization's dynamic work. Everything you're doing, your email marketing, your webinars, your events calendar, your social media, all of that stuff is all driving through and around your website. And it can be really hard to keep all of that stuff moving along successfully while you're also trying to shepherd a major redesign through. You probably didn't like hire some new people just to work on the redesign. You probably got the same amount of staff capacity, but now you're trying to juggle that redesign while also maintaining the current thing. Psychologically, it can also just be frustrating. Like if your team is really exciting to like work on the new website because it's really cool, it's going to make things so much better. It can be kind of a drag to then have to go and like perform updates on the old site when there's no real enthusiasm internally about the old site. So it can be really tough to make sure that you're really taking care of what's still public while you're working on what's coming up next. Another pitfall of redesign is that it can be hard to make informed decisions about how something should work or how something should look. You can, of course, during a redesign process and should, put everything through various sorts of user testing and performance testing, card sorts, whatever you can to get feedback from potential real users during that design process. But fundamentally, it's really, really hard to know exactly how your site is going to work in the hands of your users until it's live, until they're interacting with it. And that means that you're changing things and you're making decisions without data as to whether or not people are going to like it and it's going to work for them. If you think about like the scientific method where you try to like change one variable and see if that has an effect while you hold all other variables constant, when you're doing a redesign, you're changing lots of variables all at the same time. So it can be very hard to know which of those changes actually had what effect. And then sort of the last thing I like to say about redesign is that it comes with a huge risk. Because you're changing so much, because you're spending so much, usually on a complete redesign, you get this sense from higher ups or whatever of like, oh, we spent $50,000, we better get this right. Whether that's $10,000 or $100,000 within your organization, it feels like a large investment and it feels like the stakes are high. And so, it's this risk of like making sure the new website does what it's supposed to do and, everybody's happy about it. But sometimes we also find that success is really hard to define when launching a new website. There may be so many issues that are being addressed. Maybe you're trying to get donations to go up, but you're also trying to make it easier for staff to post new blog posts. If you've got multiple factors here that you're trying to address with a redesign, it can be really hard to define, was the project overall a success? You might be able to say if particular parts of it are, but it can be very hard to say if the whole project was, just because there's so much going on. And that can lead to sort of an unsatisfying feeling afterward where you realize, oh, well, there was some good and some bad. So this iterative approach is sort of the alternative approach to this, like, redo the whole thing. So if you take this iterative approach, there are a number of advantages. The first, these parallel sort of the disadvantage of those pitfalls. The first is that smaller changes mean less disruption for your users. It also means less disruption for search engine optimization. If you're just changing your footer, or you're just changing, the layout of your blog, but the whole rest of the site is staying the same during some iterative release, your users may be like, oh, this little thing has changed, or oh, they reorganized the homepage a little bit. But it's clear it's the same site, it's the same property, it's the same organization. You're not throwing them off their game by changing everything. So they're less likely to sort of balk if they can still find stuff that still feels familiar enough. Another advantage of this iterative approach is that it's more agile. You can plan, design, and implement something, and then observe if it worked or didn't. If you're just changing, let's say, the press room, you can look at your traffic in Google Analytics or whatever beforehand and see, how many, visits your press releases are getting, maybe how many clicks to the contact us form. You may actually be getting phone calls to your communications team. You can maybe keep track of how many you're getting. And then when you redesign, you can actually measure those differences. You can see oh, are people spending more time in the press center now? Are we getting more contact us submissions? Are we getting more phone calls? That sort of thing. You can actually, since just changing one thing, you can really focus on gathering the data before and after about that one thing, and figure out if that's having an effect. Sometimes that one thing can be something very, very simple. It can be like an A/B test of the color of the donate button in your header. Maybe it's always been in one of your brand colors and your whole brand palette is muted shades of blue. Maybe you try experimenting and making that donate button bright red for a while. It may not be in your brand palette, but you can very easily measure if that change had an effect. Leave that button up for a while and see if it's getting more clicks. And so you can measure the impact of very specific changes, where when you're doing redesign, you can't measure the impact of specific changes. You can just measure the impact of everything that changed. And this allows you to make better decisions because you have more data. Another nice thing about taking a more iterative approach is that you have more predictable and sort of ongoing costs. So instead of a big budget that might actually expand as your technology partner hits unexpected problems, or you come up with new requirements. We see this all the time at Corner Shop as a design agency for nonprofits that, projects change, projects shift, deadlines get missed, things like that, the budget winds up changing. And that can be a huge stressor. Whereas if you go with an iterative sort of approach, you can actually sort of in advance allocate a fairly consistent amount of money and staff resources, and sort of just, procedurally go through change after change after change. And they may not be as deadline driven. There may not be as contingent on, launch deadlines and that sort of stuff. And you've got this flexibility where instead of everybody focusing on this ramp up of stress around this one big launch day, your stress is distributed sort of through all these smaller changes. And so it's sort of less taxing for the team to be constantly iterating than to everything crescendoing all at once toward launch day. Another great thing about iterating, and this sort of gets back to some of the other stuff I've talked about already, is that since you're making changes in smaller chunks, there's less risk. If it turns out that changing that donation button from blue to red had a negative impact on your donations, it's easy to change it back. You've got data, you can see that it had a bad effect, and it was just a small change. You can't really walk back a whole website redesign. That I've never heard of anybody doing that before. I guess maybe it's possible, but it can be much easier to walk back small changes here and there if they turn out to not be working well, or just consider iterating over them rather than walking them back, but make an additional change to the change you just made to see if that fixes things. This means that there's less reward sort of per each change. You don't get that sort of big high, we launched a whole new website. But even though there's less reward per change, because you're thinking about and changing fewer things at a time, and you're more able to measure those successes, at the end of the year, being able to itemize out for your leadership or anybody in your team, a series of smaller wins that that this button is working better, that the press center is more efficient, that your homepage is getting more clicks. Being able to itemize out lots of small wins when you're confident there's wins and you have data behind them can actually be more compelling and useful than sort of one big mushy like, hey, we launched a new website last year. It gives you more stuff to point to, even if it doesn't sort of come all at once. Of course, this iterative design process does have some challenges, and Allison is going to be able to speak to some of those really, really well. But a couple of them are that it's a paradigm shift. If you're not used to working in this way, or your leadership or your communications team or your technology partner or maybe your funders, if they're not used to thinking this way or working this way, it can be kind of a mind-bending idea. I think about funders in particular who like to give a grant to redesign a website or give a grant to launch a new campaign site or something like that. But if you're doing sort of slower, smaller changes over time, it's less of a compelling ask. We need X amount of money to redesign our website. So it can be hard to persuade people that this is the way to go. And it's also really, really critical to get that buy-in from whoever it is that this is the way you're going to go. You can't sort of, just sort of muddle your way through with people being skeptical. You also, sort of along those lines, need the right team. And I say this both internally and externally. You're going to have people in-house that are in charge of your content or know your users or your donors or that sort of work. You might also, maybe you had a whole technology team in-house that can redesign your site and do all of that. And you don't rely on a consultant or something like that. But you need to make sure that whether it's internal or external, that the team has the skills, not just to build the website features, but also has the knowledge and skill set to perform those tests. If you're making data-informed decisions, that means you need to have a team where people understand how to collect that data, whether it's from Google Analytics or some other tool, but also have the tools and the knowledge to analyze that data and take that information and actually make informed decisions based on it. If you can, just slapping Google Analytics up on your site and being like, hey, we've got data, without knowing how to interpret it, means you're not taking advantage of it to the best of your ability. So you need to make sure you've got the right people who buy into this concept, and those people have the right skills to be able to make these changes and review them. Related to that, you need the right tools or the right platform. So at Corner Shop, we're an agency, we work almost exclusively with WordPress. And WordPress is a platform that happens to be very amenable to this sort of constant tinkering and adjustments and that sort of thing. Some other platforms are also very amenable to it. And people can have differences of opinion about whether a particular tool or platform can really adapt to this. It would be my opinion that Drupal is less capable of this because major releases of Drupal do require substantial sort of redesigns and re-architectures, but it all depends. You also need to have good A/B testing tools, whether that's like, Google Optimize or Optimizely or something like that. You're going to need some way to measure things. Data tracking, whether that's Google Analytics or Crazy Egg, or there's lots of different tools out there. But you need to make sure that you have the ability to compare data across changes and understand it and that kind of stuff. So you need tools that's going to actually track that for you. If you have some sort of proprietary CMS, if you have something where you don't have like a development and a staging version of your site where you can have your development team test out changes before they get deployed to production, to make sure that nothing else is going to break, that sort of thing. It can be very hard to take this approach because every time you're making a change to your live site, you might be destabilizing a little bit if you don't have a way to sort of like test it somewhere else first. So you definitely need the right sort of platform for your site, as well as the right tools and team in place. So with all of that said, if you're interested in some of this iterative stuff, just some really basics thing on how you might want to get started. The first step I would say is create a roadmap. The idea is not to just sort of like wake up in the morning and be like, hey, what should we change on the website this week? But actually have some sort of plan for, what are your problem areas? What do you think you want to address first? Where do you want to head? Where do you want to be a year from now if you're making a series of iterative changes? You know, if you need to deviate from that roadmap, if after your data tests are showing that your changes aren't helping or whatever, I mean, you can. But it can be very helpful to have, you know, still have a larger vision of where you're trying to get to with a series of changes rather than just sort of like, you know, flying by the seat of your pants of what you're going to change that month or whatever. So that goes along with identifying your biggest pain points. That like probably the thing you want to do when creating that roadmap is figuring out what are the things that really need to change the most. And again, I sort of alluded to this a couple of times, but those pain points can be external. They can be for your users. They can be things like, you know, we're not getting enough donations and we think it's because our donation form is ugly. But it could also be something that's strictly internal, like, oh, it's very hard for our comms team to post new blog posts or to upload images or something like that. Like it could be a maintainability issue of, oh, our financial team can't post our 990 every year because the website doesn't let them. You know, so figure out what those pain points are, regardless of sort of who's causing them, and maybe think about what are the steps you might want to try to address those biggest pain points, because those are the things you're going to probably want to tackle first in your roadmap. Of course, as I've been saying, you want to use data analytics. So before you get started on anything, you know, make sure you've got data collection tools on your site. Google Analytics is the one we see the most with our clients, but you know, you may be using Google Tag Manager and HubSpot or whatever else it is. But you make sure you've been gathering data for a while before you get started, because you may not have, you know, if you just start making changes, you know, a couple of days after you add one of these trackers to your site, you may not have as much data as you need to really do a good before and after comparison. So make sure your teams are figuring out, you know, how many donations you're getting, or you know what your listserv sign up data has been over the last couple of months to figure out, oh, we're adding 500 people a month to our email list. You know, get a real solid foundation for a couple of months at least, if you don't have it, before you start doing some of this stuff, so that you really do have a before and after to compare to. And then, of course, measure these results. If you have those tools in place, if you have the before, as you're making these changes, figure out what happened. Did our donations go up? Did our email list stuff go up or down? You know, and sometimes it can still, even in this iterative approach, be hard to separate, like, oh, well, there was a special event that was going on, so we expected a spike. Maybe you can compare the spike in that special event to what happened last year, or something like that. Or, you know, it's not always perfect. Maybe you can't do a before and after comparison that's fair sometimes, but you can still try to measure your results and figure out if the changes you're making are alleviating that pain, whatever that pain was. So that's just sort of a really basic concept around how to get started. But that's me talking about theory, which is just sort of the ideas. I'm now going to hand it over to Allison, who knows what it's like to live this. So Allison?
Yep, and Ben, you're going to forward the slides for me, right?
Yes.
All right. So hello, everyone. Again, I am Allison Hinchman. I am the Director of Digital Engagement and Acquisition at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We are an organization that helps people save places and buildings that matter to them. And yeah. All right. So our website is savingplaces.org, and I'm going to talk primarily about that website with you all today. We launched savingplaces.org in its current form in October of 2015. So it's a pretty old site at this point. We like to think it's held up pretty well. So it's a good example of adopting this process. The slide that you're seeing now is a screen capture of a landing page on our site. And I've highlighted two elements just as an example that did not exist when we launched the site. One is some join, donate, renew buttons in the upper right-hand corner. And towards the bottom of the screen capture is what we call a synopsis, which allowed us to pull a very strong call to action towards the top of the page. Next, yes. So I'm going to talk first about what I think it takes to make this process work from a practical level, and then I will, at the end, I have a few suggestions for when it might not actually work for you. So first of all, You need a really good technology partner. And I choose the word partner because hiring a partner is different from hiring a vendor that will deliver a website. You want a partner who will stick with you, who will learn about your organization. They will complement any internal strengths and weaknesses. They are very interested in your success. They're not just interested in the completion of the job. You want to trust them as experts and trust them to provide advice, not just execute based on the task before them. And the corollary of that is never ask a programmer if something is possible because they will always say yes. So you want them to also give you advice about whether it's something that you should do. We work with Bigot Labs, which is based in Falls Church, and they just helped us with a whole content strategy for our African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund that has had renewed relevance in our current time. And because they know us and they know our CMS, they were easily able to jump in to take a holistic view and make a strategic intervention. So having them as our partners was really helpful. The next thing I think is that you need stability on the client and vendor side. You have a partner and you need to maintain a shared vision. High turnover, egos who want to put their stamp on things and do it their way, it's not going to work. As Bigot's staff has changed, there's been enough overlap to keep it consistent. And until very recently, there was very little change at the National Trust side. So that has helped keep everything consistent. I would say that the programmer change is probably the biggest risk since code can be so idiosyncratic. For our site, everything is actually captured in GitHub, and Bigot has a very good process for consistency, so that has also helped as their programmers have changed. You also want to make sure you have support from leadership. So as I said, big egos who want to put a stamp are not helpful. We've had 5 or 6 CMOs since we launched the site, chief marketing officers, and all were okay with the website and not eager to relaunch, which is great. I would say that dealing with our legal office is a bigger battle. Multi-year contracts for us add up and trigger required RFPs based on business rule thresholds. So that has been sort of an ongoing negotiation with legal to explain that it really is in the best interest of the organization not to just completely rebid out and redesign the website. I also know how much I'm budgeted for the year to make changes and roughly what that works out with per month. And so I am able to pace that. That is because we are given budget to use as we need. It's not a special line item for every request. By the way, I usually pace that to spend the majority of the money in the first 3 quarters of the year, because if your nonprofit is like mine, in the 4th quarter of the year, they start looking for budget cuts. So the next item is to keep a wish list or roadmap, and I think Ben touched on this as well. Maybe you have an idea that hits you and it's too late for the page or the program that you're working on, write it down. Use Google Doc, use Excel, we use Airtable. We also use Basecamp and Slack. So when I have an idea, I write it down and I capture it. And then we are constantly reassessing priorities and level of efforts on a bi-weekly or monthly basis to decide what is important now, what do we need now, what can wait, and what's going to have the biggest impact versus being something that just is like quirky and bothers me, but isn't affecting the user experience. So I would say the next important one is that you need to be willing to do things slowly in order to do them well. I'm sure we've all heard that you can do things well, quickly, or cheaply, pick 2. So what you're doing is you are choosing to do things a little bit more slowly and to do them well. And affordably rather than do them quickly. And a redesign can be tempting because you feel like it solves all your problems at once. This is about being a little bit patient and solving your problems as you need to. So the wish list that I mentioned before helps to get ahead and anticipate future needs. Get the stuff on there as soon as you think of it, even if you're not quite sure what the full idea is, and then when it comes up again, you can flesh out the idea. So this is the other thing, if your brand hasn't changed, that also really helps. We had a tweak to our brand color palette and thought it would be really easy to change the website. Turned out being super, super complicated, and expensive, but luckily our creative team decided that it was a minor enough change that we didn't need to change it online, that between print and online, very few people would notice that. But if we had a total radical change and suddenly everything had to be purple instead of blue, we probably would have to redesign our site. Okay, this one is very important. We have a robust CMS document, CMS manual, content management system manual, and we have standard operating procedures for specific tasks. This is a shared Google Doc between Viget and the National Trust. And when we have a major feature change, at minimum, we flag that that documentation needs to be updated. And if we have time, we will go ahead and update it in the moment. And then periodically, I will authorize Viget to spend time updating this, going through the entire thing and updating it at least, once a year or so. I can also make updates, but sometimes it's useful to just have someone comb through everything. We also have standard operating procedures for when we need them. I think this is particularly interesting if you have two systems that are interacting or a specific team handles a task and they're not your CMS power users. One example is that Engaging Networks is our email donation advocacy platform, and we have some interactions and embeds and integrations, and so those are documented. As well, we have a user-generated content platform that has separate login from our content management system, so there are some people that see just that admin module. And we have lots of reviewers, and they don't really know how to use the CMS, so there's a separate SOP for those people. Next. All right, so when we do make a major enhancement, we try to think about other ways that we might use it so that we're not solving one immediate problem, we're actually solving an organizational problem. If it's for a specific use case, we think about how we might make it flexible enough to use in a different way. We also start simple and as functionality as we need it, rather than trying to anticipate every possible scenario in which we might use something so that we don't get locked into one development path. I would also say that for certain things, having defaults or fallbacks help. So for things like the SEO metadata on our pages, all of them have default values, but also we can optimize and overwrite those values. And I would say another example is as part of our work with recent work with Viget on our African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, they recommended creating a sub-navigation, which is not a thing that we actually had, but it's a thing that we could have used a year ago and that I'm actually going to use starting tomorrow for our conference. So it was an idea that we had an additional use case, and then we found it was a recommendation from them, and we went ahead and did it because I knew it was a thing that could solve multiple problems. The other thing that we do is that we trust our humans to follow our standard operating procedures, and we lock things down or automate them only when we have to. Sometimes that means doing things is a little bit tedious, but it also allows for flexibility. So my final is a bonus item, which is it's super helpful if you have taken this approach, because the immediate future is uncertain. And I don't know about you all, but we've had to put a temporary stop work on all non-essential projects at the beginning of the year, and that included website enhancements. In February of this year, we had just completed a medium-sized project where we had chipped away at a bunch of enhancements. So we were actually in a really good place. We weren't planning on doing a huge redesign then. We were in a really good place. And we probably would have started thinking about budgeting for a redesign in this winter, and we still might, but the future is so uncertain right now that we've been able to keep going, and that is because we have kept up. We weren't holding all the things that weren't working for us for a future redesign. We were solving them as they occurred to us. So as I mentioned, this is our African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund page. As I mentioned, we recently completed a content strategy for this program, and this is a great example of when sticking with Viget has worked for us. This is a program that is sort of the greatest among equals of our programs and with renewed relevance right now. And they were able to do this complete content strategy for us in about 5 weeks because they know us and they know the CMS. The information architect from 5 years ago came back onto the team and led the project, was easily able to get up to speed on the CMS. We'll be using some of the existing functions in different ways, and the only thing that we're adding is a subnav. And the front end and back end developers are guys who worked on the site for a couple of years. So it really made this little mini project much more efficient than it would have been if we were coming into it fresh. So there are a couple things that I would say where this might not work for you. Questions to ask yourself. Can I go to the next slide? I have a framework that I like to thought exercise I used to use to myself. Whenever someone presents an idea, and my knee-jerk reaction is, we tried that. I think it works here as well for deciding if you really do need to do a redesign. So, number one, have we changed? Have we rebranded? Is there a fundamental change to how you fulfill your mission? Have you changed your business or membership model? Has your capacity changed in a drastic way and you can't support the website anymore? For instance, if we have no in-house programmers, but if we had 3 in-house programmers and the organization decided that we needed to eliminate those positions, we would be stuck. We would probably have to start from scratch with because no one would know how the website works. So next, has the community or audience changed? Have they changed? Have your donor expectations changed? Have your client expectations changed? Have their needs changed? And you can't meet those expectations and needs with your current website. And then finally, has the technology changed? When we made the switch to our current website, one of the big reasons is because we were frustrated with making our old website mobile responsive on the old system. So that was just a huge technology gap that we couldn't bridge with the old site. Maybe back in the day you had a website that relied on Flash and you needed to get rid of that. We also had a website that had an old domain, and for technical reasons, Corner Shop actually helped us with this website. We couldn't switch the domain to match our new Saving Places brand. And so we literally had to redesign the website to use the savingplaces.org domain on that website. Yeah, so that is my spiel. If folks have any questions, it would be great if you could use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window.
Yeah, it looks like we've gotten 2 questions so far. I'll take the first one, and maybe Alice, you can take the second one. So somebody asked, do you know where you can find strong examples of a website roadmap? Which I think is an excellent question. And unfortunately, my answer is no, I don't know of a good place to find strong examples. And I think part of the reason for that is because it can vary so much from organization to organization. If you've got a budget of $10,000 and you're a nonprofit of 2 or 3 people, your roadmap might be a Google Doc with some bullet points. If you're a large enterprise organization with a bunch of websites and sort of microsites within some of those websites, and you've got a whole communications team interfacing with your development team, interfacing with your press team or whatever, that roadmap might be a much larger document worked on collectively and need to dive into a lot more detail. So I would say some of it is sort of a right sizing. But what's a good example is just, it's hard to share because, if we gave you something, it could be totally inappropriate for, what your needs are.
So our next question is, do you have any advice for handling leadership that supports your strategic vision, but can be impatient and wants to get things done quickly? I know, no one understands how hard, the easy things are hard and the hard things are easy. The things they think are hard are easy. That's a really tough one because I think it depends on why you are, why they are being impatient and wants things done quickly. Personally, I think taking this approach manages the cash flow for the organization a little bit better. So that might be, if you can make that financial case, that might help. And also some of the things that Ben outlined about the disruption when you're trying to do everything all at once, there's some opportunity costs for the other work that your team might have to do. I hope that answered your question. Do you have any addition to that, Ben?
No, that's great.
All right.
We've got another one asking about saying their website architecture no longer makes sense based on how the organization has evolved. And I think that this process is appealing, but they're wondering if it would work. Like what do you need to know in order to redo the architecture? And this is a tricky one. I think this depends on how much that architecture is changing. Because if it's a matter of we've got five links in our primary nav and we're going to relabel some of them and move some things around under each of them, that's probably hopefully whatever system or architecture you're on is pretty amenable to just sort of moving some things around. You might need to do some development around like breadcrumbs if you've got those on those pages to make sure they're in the right section. But if you're doing a more extensive architecture reorganization, I think that's what you need to know is how deep is the scope of that reorganization. You might find yourself in a place where, we're splitting things up and we're going to have a primary nav and a utility nav. And we're going to have drop-down menus that we didn't used to have before. And the labels on those links are much longer than the labels were in the old nav. And so it doesn't, like the design doesn't fit on mobile anymore. And that sort of stuff. And now suddenly it's not just an architectural change, but that architectural change is forcing pretty significant design and code changes just to sort of fit that new architecture. So I think the answer is you need to spend a lot of time hopefully talking to users, maybe doing card sort exercises or some things to figure out what you're going to want that new architecture to be. And then based on the difference between the old and new, I think that will inform sort of what your next steps can possibly be in terms of how big of a thing are you actually biting off here.
So I would add to that. I think depending on what you mean by how your organization has evolved. So over the winter, our leadership decided that we would reorganize the way that we talk about our work under 4 priorities that arguably are not that interesting to someone coming to our homepage. So that was a pretty easy thing. It didn't we weren't fundamentally changing the way that the National Trust did our work. It's just the way that we were marketing it. So that was pretty easy. We made some changes to the top nav. There are 4 cards at the bottom of our homepage, if you're curious, where you can see what those 4 priorities are. But I would say that this project that I talked about, the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, did not exist in October 2015. It was launched at the end of 2017. Part of the reason we had to do this big content strategy is that as that program has grown organically, it's arguably a program that's strong enough that it could have a microsite, but we don't do microsites. So if we were doing, we might have organized our entire CMS differently to accommodate this sort of outlier program. I would say that our conference website is a similar thing where it's like an outlier program. So that's what I would add to that.
Great, thank you.
What is your feeling about having a lot of content on the website or having it more of a conduit to social media sites? I also manage social media for the National Trust. I have feelings.
What are those feelings, Allison?
Actually, our site is enormous. We used to produce a news story. We are very content heavy. We used to produce a news story every day. And you will notice that. Someone asked about a roadmap. Well, I guess this is a different thing, but basically every page on our website is nearly orphaned because almost all of our traffic comes from organic search or Facebook or email. So other than our homepage, people are coming to our website from someplace where we have promoted that content. So even if we are doing something on social media, we are linking back to our site. And we partly do that because if we can get them on our website, we can ask them for money, we can ask them to sign up for email. So just in terms of that conversion funnel, we want people to do that. It is not that easy to find an individual piece of content because there's so much. There's a navigation can only do so much. We really expect people to either use the search on our site or to be coming directly to a page. I don't know if that answered that question, but certainly we have lots of content on our website.
Yeah, I mean, our perspective at Corner Shop is, it does depend a little bit on your audience and, your communication goals and that sort of thing. But to sort of Allison's point, typically, I think for most of our clients, we almost ask this question in the opposite way. Rather than having the site be a conduit to social media is a conduit to your site. A tweet can only be so long. A Facebook post is a link and engagement if it's, short and has an image, some stuff like that. There are other social media platforms that have other limitations or whatever, and you need to be in those places. You need to be engaging your audiences in those places. But you're not in control in those places. Facebook can decide what they are and aren't going to allow, or they can, delete your posts or, change how groups work or whatever. Your website is like the safest place for your content to live because you own it and you're in charge of it. And you can reorganize it how you want or style it however you want. So yeah, we generally say, put your content on your website and drive people to it. To Allison's point, it can often be very helpful to think of every page on your site as sort of a landing page. Don't assume people are just scrolling through your blog and clicking on things. They're probably getting to that blog post because you tweeted it or because you put it on Facebook. Or somebody shared it on Facebook, so they may not even know who your organization is. They just know that this headline was interesting, and sort of your job on that blog post that's now a landing page to not just provide the content of value, but provide that context and maybe some other links and sort of draw them in up that ladder of engagement because they're coming to you not through what we used to think of as your front door and your homepage. Initial hits are coming through those other pages.
I think that's our last question.
Yeah, I think we're about out of time. So thank you everybody for attending. I hope this was
Thank you all
useful.
for joining.
Thank you, Allison. Thanks to our host as well. And we hope you enjoy the rest of Netroots Nation 2020 online.
Thank you all.